60 years ago in Cuba, there was a revolution that affected not only its citizens, but also the whole world. It changed the way people thought about the idea of revolution itself. It showed great leadership and it was an example of nationalism that allowed the revolting party to have success. The 20th century is referred to as the Great Experiment. There were two dominant superpowers known as the US and the USSR, which had two greatly different economic ideals that took place in the world. The first was communism, an economic ideal that valued equal distribution of wealth and strong governmental interference. This was the one that the Cuban Revolution was built on. The second was capitalism, which, unlike the former, valued little interference from the government and had intense competition between private enterprises. Both had their limits tested by the other, and both ideals always got in the way of another. Cuba was one of the smaller nations who found themselves handling the brunt of the conflict between these two superpowers. The nation was the epicenter of many standoffs between the US and the USSR, including the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was the first time in which the US military was ordered to DEFCON 2. The Cuban Revolution also stood as an important milestone of the Cold War. This period not only marked the end of the US-Cuban alliance, but also marked the beginning of escalated tensions between the US and the Soviet Union. But how exactly did the Cuban Revolution start, and what were the effects of its outcome? How was the government the same or different following the revolution?
The citizens of Cuba revolted to the dictatorship because they were impoverished and needed another government to take control. Fulgencio Batista was the dictator that was in power before the revolution. However, he was more of a reformer than a tyrant in the 1930s. He enacted many reforms that made him popular with the public, like expanding the education in schools, giving pensions for veterans, and writing a new constitution. It consisted of giving the right to vote to everyone, having mandatory education, and outlawing the death penalty. Batista ruled Cuba 2 times, and the first time he ruled Cuba, he was revered and welcomed by many of the citizens. However, Batista fled to Portugal in order to find political asylum. 8 years passed before he gained the leadership position, but things have changed for Batista. People no longer welcomed him. He lost public support after he fled and left his people. So, he did the only thing that would give him political leverage again. Batista staged a military coup. A young man originally running for Congress, Fidel Castro was an extremely influential leader of the revolution. He saw that Batista's coup robbed him of a spot in the government, so he started to rebel and teach people his ideas. Castro threatened Batista's power, which made Batista more brutal than before and even pushed him to obtain a state of dictatorship. As Batista's dictatorship continued, there were increasing amounts of corruption through bribes, inefficiency in actually passing helpful laws, and police brutality that was often unjustified. Castro was a fierce communist guerrilla and a strong leader by this point in the revolution. However, he was quickly seen as more of a friend to the people. Citizens believed that revolution was the only way to make the change because dictatorship was extremely powerful, so they worked in collaboration in order to make a change. Castro was able to gain support from the people of Cuba because of his charismatic personality and his tactical plans. Castro promised his followers that he will create a workers' utopia which attracted the working class, as the economy back then was completely devastated.
The first act of the revolution was on July 26, 1953. Castro and an estimated 150 men decided to storm a military garrison, the Moncada Barracks, located in Santiago de Cuba. It was similar to the French Revolution's act of storming the Bastille for weapons. However, Castro and his men failed terribly. They were outnumbered and the majority of them were killed. Those who weren't killed were sent to jail. Batista, enraged with Castro and his attempt at rebellion, planned to have him killed. Castro, however, was released in 1955 and fled to Mexico for his life. He later came back to Cuba on November 26, 1956. Batista's military then ambushed Castro and a few dozen men about a week later on December 2nd. The survivors of this attack fled to the Sierra Mountains. There, Castro and his supporters started to make a plan. This plan allowed them to develop a revolutionary army. During this time, the citizens of Cuba began to revolt. Meanwhile, Castro and his army in the mountains were fueling the revolution. He worked with his brother and Che Guevara, another influential leader that decided to join the revolution after seeing the poverty and misery of people living in rural areas. Guevara worked faithfully as Castro's military advisor. The mountain range proved itself to be very helpful. The trees made a secluded haven for the communists, where supplies could be delivered discreetly.
Batista, with the fear of losing his unlimited power, killed and jailed anyone who tried to revolt against his dictatorship. In the time leading up to his escape, Batista's government was brutal. His action became reckless and without reason. Batista even had 38,000 troops ready to attack, just waiting for his word. Batista resorted to brutal power and clout to oppress the people. This only led Batista's reputation to be impaired, while further skepticism rose among the citizens. Castro was able to rally 50,000 of his supporters to help fight the troops and police. He demanded that Batista resign from his position as dictator. Batista refused. On December 31st, 1958, the day before the New Year, the people of Cuba took to the streets in protest. After he had celebrated the New Year, Batista fled from his country with several of his colleagues and other political military leaders. He did this whilst holding the pressure and anxiety that his country would come and assassinate him. He never returned to Cuba for the rest of his life, as he died in Portugal of leukemia. His death happened 2 days before Castro, who now controlled Cuba, had originally been planning to assassinate him. After Batista fled, people began to celebrate in public with hopes for a brighter future and a cleaner state.
After the Cuban Revolution, Fidel Castro was elected by the citizens of his country. He was elected with no competition. Although he fought for freedom against the dictatorship during the revolution, Castro himself ended up following a dictatorship during his rule. While the Cuban Revolution had some profound fundamental effects on Cuba, both governments, both before and after the revolution, followed a strict dictatorship. However, the Cuban people were still more comfortable with Castro's new regime because they felt like they had helped put him in power and helped him take control in the first place. He was generally accepted by the public and didn't have struggle while becoming president. What were the immediate and long-term causes/consequences of these events?
The long-term effects of the Cuban Revolution in Latin America were far greater than anyone who participated could have imagined. One in particular was the catastrophic blow the aftermath of the Cuban Revolution inflicted on post-revolution Cuba. At first, the revolution seemed to be promising positive economic changes. People were able to have access to free healthcare and education. The spread of income was also more evenly distributed. As years elapsed, however, the festering flaws within the economy gradually began to reveal themselves. Having seen that Cuba had completed its transformation to a communist government, the US imposed harsh economic sanctions that barred Cuba from trading with other nations. Imports and exports plummeted by 80%, and the country's GDP dropped by 35%. During Castro's reign, there was literally no economic growth within Cuba. Little of what happened was when Castro relinquished some of his control and removed some of his strictest economic policies. By the end of his regime, Castro left 11 million people in extreme poverty, and the Cuban economy was pretty much where it had been back in 1959. 40 years after Castro's successful coup, GDP per capita only increased by $40, while neighboring states such as Ecuador skyrocketed from $1,975 to $3,809. While the economy back in 1959 was compatible with its neighbors, Cuba was now significantly lagging behind its counterparts. This was thanks to Castro's failed decisions to make a planned economy and the dissolution of the Soviet Union. In other words, there was this large economic experiment called the 20th century, where socialist and capitalist ideals were put to the test. The former did not work at all. All in all, the Cuban Revolution has brought many changes to the world, including Cuba's sudden transition from a dictatorship to a communist nation governed by yet another dictator. Angered by corrupt leadership and plagued by economic disaster, the proletariat searched for an alternate source of government that would fulfill their needs. Finding comfort in Fidel Castro's communist ideals, they gradually formulated plans to overthrow the government and executed a successful coup in 1959. This sent Batista into exile and left Castro with unlimited power, who subsequently established a communist dictatorship. However, Castro's ruling resulted in an economic meltdown for Cuba. His ideas didn't work, and his nation was far from the utopia that he had originally imagined. Ultimately, the Cuban Revolution had the same outcome as the French Revolution. The revolution turned against the ones who started it, subsequently unleashing a period of great turmoil and misery.